As mentioned earlier, one of the first perspective paintings was a fresco, The Trinity by Masaccio. Fresco, a painting technique that flourished during the Renaissance in Italy's warm climate, involves painting with powdered pigment mixed with water onto wet plaster. As the mixture dries, the pigment and plaster become part of the wall. The plaster consists of natural materials from the earth like sand and water and lime. Similarly, the pigments come from various materials like plants and even semi-ground precious stones. An example is lapis lazuli. Art materials are primarily derived from natural elements found in the earth, and the pigments only need a binding agent to apply the color to a surface. Common binders include casein, which is derived from a milk protein, and another is called encaustic, and that's used by heating beeswax. Tempera is another medium that combines pigments with egg yolk as a binder. While tempera was popular for illuminated manuscripts and produced vibrant colors, these works needed protection from sunlight to prevent from fading. That's a quality known as light fastness. Jan van Eyck, an artist from Northern Europe, recognized the limitations of these existing binders. Frescoes, being part of a wall, couldn't be moved. Viewers had to visit churches to see them. Tempera paintings, which were on paper usually, although they were portable, required storage in darkness, so they could only be viewed on special occasions. These constraints led Van Eyck to experiment with oil painting, mixing pigments with oil instead of using something like egg. When oil and pigment mix and have contact to the air, they oxidize, they harden. This discovery allowed Van Eyck to paint on wood panels and eventually onto linen or cotton canvases. This innovation made it truly portable. Paintings could now be displayed in homes rather than remaining fixed to a church wall. Canvases also offered flexibility in size, determined by either the artist or the patron. Art moved beyond religious themes in churches, and people could now commission portraits of family members and acquaintances. Jan van Eyck created the Arnolfini portrait in 1434, depicting a betrothed couple. The painting is packed with symbolism, from their clasped hands and the other hand on her belly to the colors of their garments and even the dog and the wooden shoes on the floor. But there's other fascinating elements. In the background, a convex mirror reflects the couple's image. This reflection demonstrates not only perfect linear perspective, a technique that was discovered just a few years earlier by Brunelleschi, but this fisheye view is framed by a scene of the Passion of Christ. These biblical references surround the Christian marriage, symbolizing and reflecting God's promise of salvation. In addition to his innovative use of perspective, Jan van Eyck is credited with inventing oil painting as both a medium and a technique. While most water-based binders dry quickly and remain opaque, oil paint dries slowly, allowing artists to paint wet on wet, and it creates thin glazes that build up transparent layers. This versatile medium enabled new approaches that, when combined with perspective, expanded pictorial depth, space, and light. We'll explore all of that more in the coming classes. Oil painting became a primary medium for European artists for centuries to come and still remain popular today. As fantastic as these new techniques in perspective and oil painting are, they create only an illusion of three-dimensional space on a flat surface. Much like these convincing but deceptive appearances, one should not accept false impressions too readily and should approach apparent advancements with skepticism. In the spirit of the time, the humanist philosopher Pico della Mirandola wrote a lengthy treatise called The Oration on the Dignity of Man in 1486. Pico followed in the tradition of Petrarch, who emphasized empirical inquiry, steering people out of the Dark Ages and toward the development that led to, well, the Age of Discovery and later the Enlightenment. The 15th century era witnessed European exploration and, of course, the voyages of people like Christopher Columbus and Vasco da Gama, all of which established global colonial empires. During this time, Florence was flourishing. Increasing wealth from global trade networks laid the foundation for modern banking systems. People began desiring luxury items like art and clothing and tea and silk. A clear distinction emerged between the affluent and who displayed their wealth through refined etiquette and manners, and how that was different from the common people, who were seen as more crude or unrefined. Paraphrasing his book On the Dignity of Man, Pico della Mirandola essentially argued that there is a chain linking Earth to God. Some animals are superior to others, but humans are unique because they can ascend this chain towards God. The more dignified and intelligent and educated a person is, the better they can demonstrate their God-given skills, the higher they can climb this chain. This thinking marked a shift away from the collective toward the individual. Pico emphasizes the ability of individuals to choose how they conduct themselves in the world and shape their personal image. Others perceive, evaluate, and judge people based on their outward appearances and behaviors. While having standards might seem appealing, it should be noted that this is entirely superficial and a focused, calculated illusion. Linear perspective, for instance, narrows one's attention to a single point on a horizon, like putting on blinders. It allows one point of view, controlled, limited, yet accurate and measurable. This perspective, while focused, lacked a broad, encompassing view of the world. There is a connection between this focused perspective in art and the flat, linear illusion that reinforces hierarchical structures. Pico observed that many craftspeople who make hats and shoes and other practical items were not considered artists, but artisans. These artisans worked in guilds, learning from one another how to improve their craft, whether it was making the best shoes or handbags or clothes. But they weren't regarded as real artists. This exceptional status of artist was reserved for the genius, the individual who climbed the metaphysical chain to God. Their creative process was seen as a direct manifestation of divine inspiration, the hand of God. Artisans were viewed as ordinary laborers compared to the true artists who were believed to possess a godly genius. This shift in perception from artists and guilds to the artist as a singular genius aligned with this rise of linear thinking and focused perspectives. It also tied closely to the writing of history, particularly art history, which further celebrated this hierarchy. Giorgio Vasari was known as the father of art history. He was not only a painter, but also wrote detailed accounts of artists from the 15th century and earlier, spanning the Gothic and Proto-Renaissance eras. His masterwork was called The Lives of the Most Excellent Painters, Sculptors, and Architects. It initially focused on artists from his native Florence, but by the third volume in 1568, he had expanded to include Venetian artists. These diaries, as they're often referred to, provide an helpful glimpse into the spirit of the time, documenting the focus and perspectives of artists during the High Renaissance. Vasari's stories often traced artists' journeys from their early recognition as talented youth through their various projects. He famously recounts how Giotto, while apprenticing under the Byzantine artist Cimabue, impressed the Pope by drawing a perfect circle freehand. Vasari frequently also included gossip and personal observations about artists' appearances. For example, while praising the success of Filippo Brunelleschi, he described him as being not very attractive and wrote, "to embellish ugliness of the body with the strength of intellect." As an artist himself, Vasari offered unique insights into artist studios and their creative process and their perspectives on art. He detailed both the practical and philosophical aspects of their creative process, including how they handled their materials. The book also chronicles the relationship between artists and their patrons, including how commissions were handled. Vasari frequently described artists' funerals, including the grandeur, location, and, well, how many people attended. Through his writings, he elevated artists from mere craftsmen to celebrities and genius. Leonardo da Vinci, the quintessential Renaissance man, achieved fame as a painter, draftsman, engineer, scientist, theorist, sculptor, and architect. Let's explore his innovative use of perspective. While linear perspective had taken hold in the Renaissance, da Vinci wrote about what was called atmospheric perspective. This simple principle of optics states that distant objects appear grayer, cooler, and have less contrast, while closer objects appear warmer with more contrast and more detail. Looking, for example, at the Mona Lisa, we can see this principle at work. The figure's temperature is warm, and the contrast between light and dark is crisp, especially in her hands and the ruffles of her sleeves. Behind her, the landscape appears blue, gray, and cool, receding into the background. This straightforward technique, commonly used by art students to create a sense of space, would later be known in the 20th century as push and pull, pushing elements into the background while pulling others into the foreground. Linear and atmospheric perspective both create an illusion of pictorial depth, a spatial quality the artist a century earlier showed little interest in. Da Vinci's Last Supper demonstrate both the techniques quite masterfully. The painting employs one-point linear perspective with Jesus at the center of the converging lines and becomes the focal point. The walls and the ceiling recede into the background, shifting to cooler tones with less contrast, while Jesus in the center remains framed in light. Donatello was primarily a sculptor, a contemporary of Brunelleschi who preceded da Vinci and Vasari. His sculpture of David is a significant symbol of 15th century Florence, which was then a small mercantile city-state in Italy, gaining strength through business, art, and architecture, in contrast to Milan's autocracy. The Medici family commissioned the sculpture, representing their ability to stand against the neighboring powers through their cultivation of culture, ingenuity, and wealth. David's biblical story tells of a shepherd boy who would later become king. When his older brothers faced a giant they could not defeat, David simply said, "I can do it." Through confidence, intellect, and divine will, David slayed Goliath. In Donatello's sculpture, David appears physically delicate, standing naked in a somewhat effeminate pose, holding the giant's oversized sword. His foot rests atop the giant's severed head, contrasting David's nakedness with his fallen enemy's heavy armor. The figure embodies a triumph of cunning and determination through seemingly insurmountable odds. Florence thrived in the late 14th century, growing as a cultural center and gaining wealth through trade and innovative banking systems. As hubris and individualism flourished, as discussed in the context of Pico della Mirandola, a friar criticized the people's arrogance and corruption in Florence. He denounced the Medici's control over the Florentine Republic, claiming they led the people away from faith towards selfish indulgences. The Medici were eventually forced to relocate to Rome, though they returned a few years later. About 60 years after Donatello's David first stood in the Medici gardens, a 25-year-old Michelangelo completed his version in 1501. Having proven his mastery with the Pietà in Rome, Michelangelo was commissioned to create a massive sculpture for the Florence Cathedral. It was a triumphant return to his hometown and a challenge to Rome's authority. This context illuminates the difference between the two Davids. The Florentines viewed David as their symbol of the city's resistance against autocracies and the Medici's control, believing themselves to be stronger, smarter, and more artistically gifted. The two sculptures differ dramatically in scale and stature. Donatello's David stands at about 5 feet, while Michelangelo's towers at 17 feet tall. Unlike Donatello's delicate youth, Michelangelo's muscular David bears an imposing presence. Carved from a single block of Carrara marble, in contrast to Donatello's bronze casting, the figure displays an intense, willful gaze as he prepares to face Goliath. Michelangelo's David embodies the Renaissance humanist ideals in its freestanding marble sculpture, celebrating human beauty and potential. Let's consider the 4 Renaissance artists who inspired the names of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Our common perception of these artists often differs from reality. For instance, when Donatello died at age 80, Leonardo was only 14 years old. While many imagine Leonardo as an elderly man, he died at 67, whereas Michelangelo, 23 years his junior, lived to a ripe old age of 88. Raphael, the youngest of the 4, died at age 37. By 1500, at the Renaissance's peak, Raphael had become the most celebrated artist, earning a commission from Pope Julius II to paint his private Vatican apartments. Meanwhile, Michelangelo was tasked with painting what was then considered a modest chapel ceiling. Though working on their frescoes simultaneously, Raphael enjoyed greater privileges, including a luxurious apartment, knighthood in a papal order, and a workshop of over 50 apprentices and assistants. One of the most well-known paintings in the stanza, also known as the Raphael Rooms, is the School of Athens. The fresco centers on Plato and his student Aristotle, surrounded by philosophers including Socrates, Heraclides, Diogenes, Euclid, and Pythagoras, among others. In the artwork, Plato holds his book Timaeus, which presents a theory of universal creation and human origins. The text describes an unchanging model where mathematical order and rationality create a beautiful universe, suggesting that humans should align with the cosmic order while pursuing knowledge and goodness. While this might seem to be a conflict with Christian creation theories, and the prominence of the pagan ancient Greeks in the Pope's residence may appear unusual, the School of Athens reflects the profound influence Greek philosophy had on the Christian theology before the Renaissance. Raphael completed the Sistine Madonna in 1512, famous for its cherubs, the putti at the bottom. This oil painting on canvas embodies Renaissance ideals through its precise perspective, anatomic accuracy, and symmetrical composition. The work achieves harmony through unity and stability, employing simple geometric shapes and the golden ratio. Renaissance color schemes primarily used what we now call primary colors, red, yellow, and blue, though artists were limited to the pigments from the natural sources like minerals and plants and animals. So no synthetic acrylic paint. In many ways, Raphael's work marks the end of the High Renaissance as painting styles shifted towards mannerism after his death. So in concluding this lecture, I want to end with questions for the discussion group. What stood out for you in relationship to the materials from the earth that involved physical objects and measurable spaces, like, for example, linear perspective? Was there anything new, or do you have more to add regarding anything that was said, or do you have a different opinion? The second part of that is, by contrast, what stood out for you in relationship to different worlds that were highlighted, with various points of view, or personal outlooks or attitudes towards things? Were you surprised by any of the various worlds that were discussed? And may be surprised by some of their differing opinions, points of view, perspective.